Well, thank you for coming. I'm Henry Hughes, and I've been a friend of this gallery for 20 years and seen many friends around me. And I was very close friends with Paul Gentry, our honored featured artist. And first, I just want to thank the people that put this together. I mean, everyone, I'm sure, worked on this, but Christine, Lori, Carol, Andrea, I know everyone, Anna, so many people have worked on this, and it's a beautiful show. It's a great tribute to a truly great, and I don't use that word casually, a truly great artist who lived in our town. And so I want to say a few things about his life and work, and then we're very honored to have Paul's sister, Catrin Gentry, here with us. Richard Bunsey, thank you. He's one of the people I talk with constantly about art and the gallery and Paul. And so there are many artists here. Many writers, I'm sure I'm a writer, musicians, people of various advanced talents. And I think we can all agree that Paul achieved maybe what a lot of us strive for, work for, dream of, maybe even sacrifice for: mastery. What does it mean to really master the art? And Paul did lots of different things, but I think we can agree, and there's national recognition to support the idea that Paul mastered the wood engraving. And so, I mean, how do you do that? What does it take to be a great artist? Okay, it's probably a very bad question, but let's endeavor to explore it. So what about Paul Gentry? He was born in Decatur, Illinois in 1954, and the family moved around a lot. Your father was the manager of like a small variety store called King's Variety Stores. They went out of business several years ago, kind of like a small-scale Bi-Mart. And the family moved to various towns in Idaho and Oregon. And so Paul had a lot of different experiences, a lot of different places. And they also lived in Warrenton, near Astoria, on the Columbia River. And I remember Paul telling many stories about how fascinated he was by all the ships. You had an uncle, right, who was a ship's pilot who'd guide the big ships into the marina. And Paul got tours, and he loved ironwork. He loved industry as well as nature. I mean, it's obvious in his work, a true love of nature. So that's an interesting kind of combination of real industrial forms, a working harbor, and yet he loved, all kinds of animals. One of the things he described, this is fascinating, it was the last kind of gasp of whaling. He actually, in detail, described a sperm whale being brought in to a whaling station at Warrenton, and it was flensed, and the fat rendered. I mean, this is something out of Moby Dick, right? It was the early 60s, before the Marine Mammals Protection Act. And Paul, with a kind of fascination and horror, because he loved animals and hated killing animals. We'd go fishing, and he didn't want to kill the fish. He'd eat them. But no, it's true, right? You know this. It's a bit of a paradox. It's okay. He was very gentle, and so he was horrified by this beautiful whale that had been killed in the 1960s. Still, yet he was fascinated by the process. Even that word "flints," a specific word for cutting the fat. And that's the kind of thing Paul loved. That kind of language too. So they moved around. They moved back to Illinois, and then Colorado Springs, where Paul attended high school. And I have some comments from you, Karen, when I did the obituary. He excelled in art and music, loved to read, but hated class. And again, that's Paul too. There's this interesting dynamic. He really loved to learn. Anyone that knows Paul, he was just tireless in the way he loved to read, watch documentaries, understand things. He loved hearing me talk about literature and poetry. But he hated structure. He hated kind of like organized society in a lot of ways. So he dropped out of high school. He got his GED, and he went to welding school at a community college and became an expert welder. Paul was a very good welder. Could have made a fortune welding. I used to tell him that. And he worked at a steel mill outside Chicago. And so we love Chicago. Again, the museums, the architecture, exactly that, right? The lake. He took a lot of photographs, hundreds of photographs, lots of sketches. Very influenced by Chicago, of course. The Institute there had a big impact on him. He loved going to the museum. But he joked that he got burned out on the steel mill. And it was, a lot of times it was the people. He was sensitive, and he was kind of an artistic intellectual, but was kind of thrown into these industrial jobs, and people like teased Paul because he was sensitive. Some of you might remember the possum story, that he loved possums, and somebody brought in a dead possum and hung it in his locker. No, it's a true story. He told me this. And so, he was kind of teased, kind of bullied, by these tough steel workers. So he left the steel mill, and he joined a furniture factory in Seattle. He had a friend who had a small furniture factory. We don't have any of his wood boxes here, but maybe some of you own them. We own a couple. Chloe and I have some beautiful, exquisite jewelry boxes. He was a master, like cabinet maker level fashioner of wood. And so we learned that at this little furniture factory. And I think they're probably all sold out. But he was great at that. And he loved the Northwest, Pacific Northwest. So Paul enjoyed hiking. He was in his prime, a very good, strong walker. Camping, observing nature, fossil collecting. Thanks to Lori, that donation, that collection, what was left of it was donated to the University of Oregon. Again, in his prime, he was a superb amateur naturalist who had a massive collection of fossils, and he documented them, and he had a book. And it was he was about to publish the book, and then they changed the laws on accessing fossil beds, that you couldn't go out with your pick and dig fossils in the old way in the state of Oregon. So the publisher canceled the book. But he loved that. And in fact, I've always thought the fossil is kind of nature's print. And here's the great printmaker. Think about the kind of geologic prints, right, that fossils leave us. He loved astronomy. So he bought this expensive telescope. And I gave him crap. I said, Paul, you can't even afford to pay your water bill. You paid $500 for this telescope. And he says, oh yeah, they just found water on Mars. So, he was joking. We were drinking vodka, of course, in his house, just a few blocks from here. And he would love to joke about that. But again, that's kind of the essence of what I want to convey, is that this genius here that also just kind of blew off other things. He just didn't care about other things that got in the way, like paying a water bill. But he wanted to see Mars because it was getting more exciting. Maybe they found some water, some frozen, maybe some ice on Mars. He took art classes at Edmonds Community College. Some of that earlier work you'll see when you walk around. Prints, drawings, very abstract, more kind of primal, iconographic kind of stuff. Wild, different from the kind of measured, controlled printmaker we know, the engraver. So that's stuff he did at community college. He also met Al Widener, became a very close friend, and Al and Paul fashioned a lot of wood. They worked with cedar, using some traditional Native American patterns, and they made dulcimers. I think they bought kits, but they also, I think they kind of put a few together on their own. So again, to add to Paul's brilliance, he could basically make a working instrument, and he could play. He could play serviceably well. He could play guitar, and he played the auto harp. He could sing. He and Lotta, actually, the Swedish cousin, made a folk album. They recorded a bunch of songs, and he played them. So in Seattle, Paul began working for Daniel Smith. Those of you who are artists know it as the very famous art supply manufacturer. Once again, Paul's intellect, engaged by the love of inks and pigments and dyes. He became like a trusted tester for the company. He also met his wife, Peggy Ashcroft, in 1994 at Daniel Smith, and they bought a property outside of Monmouth. Okay, Richard, which direction would that be, the old house?
It was on Field Road west of Monmouth, about 5 miles.
Okay. 4 miles. Beautiful rural property. And it's shortly after that Richard, you met Paul. And I remember you telling me the story. Again, I have this in my notes, that you were just astounded by the range and quality of Paul's work. Although Paul had been doing art his whole life, he'd never really officially kind of shown any or been in a gallery. And so Richard's like, oh my goodness. And then probably others of you were like, wow. And so he started, showing work. Well, Paul and Peggy got divorced, but Paul remained a member of the gallery for 20 years. So he really kind of found a new relationship with this institution and many of the people here. And I think that was probably the most important grounding, and I'll say creative force in his later life, his later adult life, was this gallery. And you should all be happy about that. You were friends, and you gave him support, and gave him a place to hang out, you know, and drink wine, and sell his art, you know. So this is a great retrospective. I am very happy to see this work. We have wonderful wood engravings, wood cuts, photography, pinhole cameras. And Paul loved photography and actually made his own cameras. We have some pottery. Paul was an accomplished ceramicist. And I remember we have a few of his coil pots, and someone came in and said, "Oh, those are nice pots. Who threw those?" I'm like, "They're not thrown, they're coil." I mean, he could construct at that level. And you know, some of you know much more about that work than I do. We have some paintings. I love his painting. Here's just a small example. But there are some paintings in the back room, if you're interested in purchasing a painting or looking at them, and many of you own some of, Paul was a fine painter. And he loved painting. So those of you who know him well know that he admired both the work and dangerously the life of those abstract expressionists, the New Yorkers, the 40s and 50s, right? Pollock, de Kooning, Mark Rothko. So it was like, it was, you know, art for art's sake. It was the full immersion in the brilliance of just being a painter and saying, to hell with the world. Again, very, very, very Gentry-like. And he also loved the freedom of that expression and just like being a real artist. But then, you know, these are the great conflicting or maybe, you know, complementary forces that made him who he was. And he came back to structure too. And he did, you know, beautiful representational, accurate drawings of horses, you know, that are splendid. Something you'd see, you know, Dürer do. I mean, remarkable work in charcoal and ink. And so he loved the abstract expressions, and he did have moments. He had a show here, you know, maybe 5 years before he passed. A beautiful. We own some of those pieces, so that you can look for his work as well. But he came back to the wood engraving, and about 2001, he really bears down on that medium. There's a lovely artist statement, I believe, somewhere here. This is just a quote from it: "The physical act of cutting a design into a block and seeing the stark clarity of the print excites me like no other medium." And then Paul also, I think, in terms of a sense of place, he'd moved around a lot his whole life, but this was his home now. So after his divorce, he bought his own house on 4th Street, and he lived there. He had a beautiful studio and a full garage, full working shop. And so that sense of place, Paul identified with the great regionalist printmakers of the Depression era, like J.J. Lanks, Thomas Nason. And you'll recognize that. And that was the golden age of book illustration too. Books had beautiful wood block or, you know, wood engraving prints. And Paul identified with that sense of place. And you'll see, I think that's really, you know, the height of his achievement as an artist is those lovely renderings of the Willamette Valley or the Northwest, whether it be the coast or inland and animals. It's just extraordinary work. That fine linear tint, these prints come alive. And I was talking to Greg Pullen, an art professor at Western. He studied with Barry Mosher, probably one of the greatest book illustrators of all time, a fantastic wood engraver. And he says, you know, Paul had a lot of Mosher's skills, but, you know, I always say, you know, Gentry also had some fun with wood engraving. Wood engraving can be a little bit limiting and rigid. It doesn't lend itself to whimsy in some ways, but Paul kind of pushed it. And if you look, again, he did over 100 we know of. I hope there's some examples here, like I know he did O'Hare Airport or city streets in New York, where you can really see him pushing the line in directions that wood engraving doesn't typically go. It is more free and loose. I really like that. He did work for this book that we did together, the fishing books, and some of these prints, like of the tuna and so on, they really have a lovely kind of a deco feel. We can look at some of these later, but he was experimenting, I think, with the limitations, but maybe the opportunities of that style. What is, you know, Paul to the nation? Well, I mean, just he's here at the Hallie Ford, at the Portland Art Museum. He's in the holdings of the Nelson Atkins Museum, that famous museum in Kansas City. Library of Congress gave him awards, collected his work, Smithsonian, the Whitney and Guggenheim in New York. He's gotten commissions from lots of wineries. Sarah Hildig is here. She was on the Arts Commission, and we helped get a beautiful set of engravings for our university here, Western Oregon. There are paintings in the Humanities Building as well. Again, I was fortunate to work with him on these 2 books. He did the wood engravings, and there's one more coming out, River Poems. He wasn't with me to do it, but we had enough beautiful river images left over to fill another book, so his legacy lives on. And we did this crazy book together, Shutter Lines. Again, this was in the heyday when Paul and I were just kind of having fun, driving around Portland, Oregon City, and yes, drinking and goofing around. And he took photographs, I wrote poems, and Chloe's on the cover. We took this picture, remember, at the church, right? The parsonage. And the pastor came out, yelled at us. That's right, okay. That's right, the shutters. We love the shutters of that church. Thank you, Chloe. It helped me interpret my own poems there. I need that. So, and it's when I worked on those books with Random House, the art director of Random House, I remember telling me these are some of the best wood engravings I've ever seen, because it was kind of a dying art to some. I'm glad to know, like, Carol is reprinting Paul's blocks, and people still work in wood engraving, but it's a slow, time-consuming process. A lot of times people use scratchboard or even digital methods to approximate that style, but he was a real wood engraver, and people who knew the old book trade really appreciated that. And then finally, Paul, I mean, he loved to cook, he loved to read, Barbara Holland, Richard Brautigan, Charles Bukowski, Mary Oliver. He loved music. He listened to classical very, very seriously, and AC/DC. He loved rock. He loved watching documentaries, and he was our friend. I mean, I have some quotes. I know, Lori, I hope we can talk after too. That you remarked how much he helped you as a photographer to kind of see and work. Richard, you and Paul would talk about things all the time and argue and debate. He was great friends with Tom Meehan, the late great Tom Meehan, a sculptor and an artist here. And I think all of us, I'd like to hear more because he was so supportive of art. And I learned a great deal from Paul. Jerry, I saw you here earlier. I know we had long conversations here with Paul as well. And so, finally, we can come back to the question, what makes a great artist? There's, of course, no answer. There's no answer. But I'll repeat the words that are stenciled on the wall here, and you can look at them later. I say that, that Paul Gentry was the most uncompromising artist I've ever known. He dedicated his whole life to making beautiful things. And that's really what he taught me too. And I can't live up to that. I don't know if I want to, but you do the art. Like nothing else really matters. It's kind of a scary zone. But I know it's true of great artists. And so you don't pay your water bill, you don't cut the grass, you don't clean your house sometimes. But we love this man. I loved this man because he was into a place that is so powerful and so rare and special that I think that's what it really means to be a master, to be a great artist. And so we might not want to go there, but maybe we can be inspired by that and just do great work. So Paul Gentry, thank you for giving us this show, and thank you all for coming today.